I'm Kathryn Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your counsellor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hi everyone and welcome to VLGA Connect, and it's time for our special edition on the Operation Sandon Report, which was released last week. And folks, we've got the heavy hitters on hand to unpack this report and the implications for the local government sector. And firstly, I have to say hello and welcome to the CEO of the VLGA, Kathryn Arndt. It's about time you made an appearance back here on VLGA Connect.
Oh, thank you, Chris. And I'm very pleased to be back and overjoyed to be finally able to have a conversation about this long-awaited report. A few years now in the making, one would say, but equally delighted that we have Steve Cooper back with us today to participate and enjoy the conversation from this point onwards.
Hello, Mr. Cooper.
Hello, Mr. Eddy. Hello, Kathryn. Thanks for those kind words. And and for the opportunity to have a chat about Sandon, because I think, like many of us in local government governance, it's been exercising our minds for a couple of years now.
It sure has. And of course, to help us wade our way through this and not do anything that might get anyone into trouble, Tony Raunic from Hunt & Hunt Lawyers is with us as well. Hello, Tony.
Hello, folks, and I know you're all very well behaved, so we're going to be okay with that. But yeah, great to see you back, Steve. And I remember years ago we were talking about you watching these proceedings and with great interest. And who would have thought that some years later we're finally able to talk about the report?
Yeah, well, my memory, Tony, it was October, November 2019. I'd just come back from overseas, had a bit of quiet time, so went into town for a couple of days. So, yes, it has taken a while.
Yeah, we've had a pandemic and all sorts of other things since then, but I'll just make the point, it takes something pretty significant to get Steve Cooper back on VLGA Connect. And folks, this is it. Lovely to have you all here. So where do we start with this? Kathryn, perhaps we might start with a broad brush response. I know it's a bit soon to get a formal position from the VLGA because everyone's still going through the report, but how do you summarise, I guess, the early reaction?
Well, Chris, as you say, it is a little early to really form a definitive position in response to the report. I think the devil will be in the detail, and some of that, well, a lot of that, much of that is yet to come. From the VLGA's perspective, though, we were very pleased to see recommendation 1, which outlines the establishment or recommends the establishment of a task force. So it will be critically important that the local government sector is well represented on that task force and has a voice around the table, because, of course, they will inform and bring provide expert input into the decisions that task force will need to ponder. I guess it's really important too to say from the outset that Operation Sandon was looking at one council out of 79 councils, and there are some pretty, disheartening findings as part of that investigation into a couple of councillors. But also not limited to just local government. There were some criticisms and findings that did not bode well for other levels of government as well also. Needless to say, though, and of course the VLGA would say that the behaviour of one councillor or 2 or 3 at one council should not reflect that those same behaviours are occurring across the board. I do think that the report clearly, or the investigation clearly took the opportunity to look at the sector broadly in terms of identifying potential risk areas and providing recommendations to improve governance, integrity and transparency, which of course the VLGA supports effective governance, transparent governance and integrity in local government. That's our bread and butter work. So I just guess I'd start by saying that.
So, Kathryn, you touched on a point there that's already, I think, a matter of contention. There's some commentary coming out from various mayors and former mayors, etc. If I can paraphrase, and I'd be interested in Steve's take on this in particular, that sense that the whole sector is going to be, for want of a better word, burdened by new requirements based on the behaviours that occurred at one council. You made the point, Kathryn, that IBAC looked a bit more broadly. I know you sat through a lot of the sessions, Steve. Does that accord with your recollection of how they were looking into these matters?
Oh, certainly, Chris. I think I'd pick up on what Kathryn said. There's very much a risk-based approach, and it's, for my mind, probably useful to take that approach, because even if the behaviours, the specific behaviours aren't there, there are certainly the exposures, not only in planning, but in a range of issues. You could say where the council stands between an interested party and a pot of money, there is a risk. And so, you know, I certainly read the report in that context.
Tony, 34 recommendations, and we discussed briefly, fairly broad brush on Friday's TGU, that some of them have come as a bit of a surprise. There's planning related ones, there's some council governance matters that perhaps we weren't expecting. Have you had a chance now to dig a little bit deeper into the implications of these?
Yeah, I have. And as you say, some unanticipated changes. I'd signal out, say, the relationship between councillors and CEOs, that employment relationship, not particularly anticipated that there would be very significant changes there. And since since that last recording you talked about, that episode we did on Friday, I've looked at that recommendation closely, and the recommended majority independently personed committee that will deal with CEO employment matters is not to be an advisory committee, but actually a determining committee, which to me means that majority of independent persons, not being councillors, will be in a position to appoint CEOs, and then of course to undertake the performance management and presumably to terminate or end the employment relationship, which is an enormous change to the way local government operates at the moment, whereby the CEO is the only employee of the council and the councillors in that sense. So some of us may have thought changes to an advisory committee, making that committee more independent. Well, in fact, if you read the IBAC recommendation, it's a determinative committee. So that would be one that I would highlight. But again, wholesale changes to the way council meetings occur, both the ordinary and special formal council meetings in terms of recording of minutes, divisions, these sorts of things, but also in relation to what occurs in the lead up, the pre-meeting meeting, which is often a phenomenon at councils, the way council or briefing sessions are handled and what is discussed at them, and whether they're limited to presentations of fact, or whether they're broader than that and have a more of a discussion about the merits of particular resolutions or proposed decisions.
On the briefing session matter, I can recall some years ago a shadow local government minister who ultimately became the minister didn't follow through on a promise to basically ban briefing sessions at councils for some of the reasons that are outlined in this report. And I wonder whether that's where we're headed with briefing sessions. Steve, I see you nodding.
Well, I was really, in fact, I was quite interested in a lot of the report, Chris, but thanks for that. It seemed the briefing sessions are a bit of a barometer for the rest of the report, that there are some quite strong recommendations, but they also require councillors and officers to understand the spirit and the intent as well as that detail. I was interested in the subtlety around briefings. That there's a suggestion that I read into the report that councillors may well be swayed by the conversation in the briefings, even if the matters aren't overtly discussed or voted on. And I'm not sure IBAC went all the way in terms of describing how to resolve that, but certainly there was a shot across the bow in regard to ensuring that insofar as possible, all briefings do is ensure that councillors are informed.
Kathryn, what about that significant proposed change to the CEO employment life cycle management? I imagine some would welcome that, because we've heard at various times in the past concerns about whether councillors as a group have the requisite skills to manage that relationship appropriately, and also calls for it to be depoliticised. This would seem to be a step towards that sort of outcome.
Look, it is, Chris, and it's certainly consistent with some pieces of work that have been done over recent years. The Local Government Inspectorate a few years ago did put a paper together on the CEO employment relationship. It also became a topic of discussion in the recent culture review into local government, and the VLGA certainly did, within its submission to that culture review, make some comments about the CEO employment relationship, as did other groups such as LG Pro. It is a complicated relationship in that we have the chief executive officer of a considerable sized business leading thousands of staff in some cases and managing millions of dollars, also being responsible to and reporting to directly to that group of councillors, and their employment being determined by that group of councillors at any sort of point in time, when the actual strategic plans and community plans that council is overseeing the implementation of actually extend well beyond one council term. So there are some, well accepted nuances with that employment relationship, which I'm not surprised that IBAC have made some comments on that and some recommendations in this report.
Kathryn, I agree, and to the panel, the report in that section is really interesting reading if one looks at the circumstances that IBAC describe around the end of the former CEO, Mike Tyler's employment, that a councillor or councillors purportedly claimed credit for, the end of that CEO appointment on the basis that, Mr. Tyler was obstructive to some of their desires in relation to planning, and had, I think the term was, lost the confidence of the council, and really important in terms of the language that's used and that we do these things for the right reasons, presumably, Tony.
Yeah, absolutely. I do feel for the councillor position. It's a substantial change. So if you're elected with a view, want to affect some organisational change, or you become aware as a councillor that you feel that the organisation, needs some cultural change or needs a particular focus towards improvement. At the moment, there are those CEO performance management processes that allow you as a councillor to participate in that. Now, of course, councillors may still have access to that committee, but it would appear that they won't have, councillors will not be in the majority in those committees if the IBAC recommendations are followed, and that makes for really substantial change in the ability of councillors to impact upon that cultural change through a change of leader. But I can absolutely see some benefits in terms of continuity. And as you say, former councillor Ablett was signalled out for having, apparently, according to the findings, made a concerted effort to remove Mr. Tyler because of his opposition to a proposed rezoning of land that would benefit Mr. Woodman's interests.
I think we do need to be careful that we don't assume that the councillors will be excluded completely from any process that might be implemented as a result of these recommendations in regard to the CEO employment relationship. I think the devil will be in the detail there, and also I'll be very interested to see on what basis those independent members would be appointed to such a committee, what would be their qualifications, and what would be the reporting framework and consultation framework with council and the community if it were to extend that far.
All of which leads to what I imagine will be the government's argument about wanting to remove the politics out of these planning decisions, the NIMBYism, as it's been described. And there's an excellent article on the weekend in The Age which unpacks a few of these themes if people haven't seen it. Tony, perhaps let's look at the planning piece of this firstly, and it would be good to tell the audience too what sort of legislative steps are going to be needed to give effect to these, assuming the government supports them.
Yeah, well, quite substantial, because we're dealing with both the strategic planning element, which is the creation and the amendment of planning schemes, rezonings, changing of policy and zoning controls. That element, part of the recommendations is to take that power away from councils to have a significant sort of determining role there. But also when it comes to statutory planning in terms of making decisions on whether or not to grant a planning permit, the move to create these independent, determining panels takes that power away from council. So that will require amendments to the Planning Environment Act, which will, so these things can't just be implemented overnight through, some sort of ministerial directive. They're going to require working up draft legislation, which will presumably go out for community comment. And that's, I guess, partly why the implementation task force is obliged to report to the public in 18 months' time, if it's set up, on how it's gone in terms of implementation of recommendations. It would suggest that there's quite a lead in time to realise some of these outcomes, which for me, if I could just add, creates this conundrum where we have council elections largely occurring in October of 2024. I think it's, beholden on the government really for those prospective councillor candidates, whether they're currently councillors or not, to tell them, what will your role be? To tell them, definitively, will they be involved in making planning decisions or not? I think it's something that one would want to know prior to running for council, just what the role will encompass.
Exactly the point that I wanted to raise, Tony, because it talks about all statutory planning matters being referred to this new body and being taken away from councillors. We know so many councillors actually put their hand up to run because of a local planning matter. It's going to be a fundamental change to why people want to run for council in the first place.
Chris and panel, I was a bit puzzled by that in terms of that detail and where it might land, because as we know, the vast majority of statutory planning matters dealt with by a council are dealt with under delegation.
Correct.
And presumably it would be in the public interest that continue. So there's a sort of a question for me, what's the line look like?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wondered, Steve, whether whilst the report recommends changes to the Planning and Environment Act, I wondered whether, if I was going to implement this quickly, I'd go down the path that we already have these major project facilitation programs where once you get over a certain threshold of size of a project, it can be called in by the minister, and expanding that process would seem to me to be a simpler exercise rather than this absolute, removing councils completely from a determining role.
Yeah, well, Tony, one of the problems seemed to be that IBAC identified was this absence of transparency of a resolution popping up that bore no relationship to the officer report, sometimes in the face of feedback from referral authorities that was opposed to a proposal, and also seeking evidence of the kind of strategic framework that a council or a planning authority might use in arriving at a decision. There's a recommendation around that. Yeah,
I actually think that you put your finger on something fundamental here, Steve, and that is if council's role in statutory planning decisions is removed, why do we need all these governance changes? Because many of those governance changes are designed to improve the integrity of planning decisions. So, for example, as you say, one of the issues identified in the report was that Councillor Aziz had moved a motion to commence a rezoning of land that would benefit woodman interests prior to there being, an officer recommendation on the table. And it was really that became a process that was entirely driven by a councillor or the councillors prior to officer input. Now, some of the model governance rules changes are designed to avoid that outcome. Are they there for the interim period prior to council's role in statutory planning being, largely diminished, or are they there for the long term? And that would be my question, because if we're purely talking then about changes in relation to policy and services type decisions, one would think there was less of a need for those, model rules, a move away from the broader performance-based decisions towards a more prescriptive approach.
It has been said to me that the proposed or recommended planning model, for want of a better word, is to mirror or model the New South Wales current planning system. So I'm not sure if any of the panel are familiar with what happens in New South Wales, or whether we want to add some comments around that.
My understanding is that there are regional panels, and that language is used in part in the report. It talks about the possibility of having regional determining panels staffed by experts in the field, and that is the practice that occurs in New South Wales.
I can confirm that from some recent news stories, Tony, and it is not a system that is supported by all. There is some commentary from some councils that we're already starting to hear about the loss of local decision-making within those planning processes, and that's something that we haven't really unpacked yet. Thoughts on whether that is the crux of this, and a fundamental change to the way our system operates that a lot of people are going to really want to protect very fiercely? Just
before we delve into that in more detail, in terms of the timing, and we talked about the 18-month report and where that might sit with the next local government elections. I did note in the Ages article on the weekend that they mention a single policy statement that the government is due to release in September that will attempt to tackle multiple objectives, which include, amongst other things, housing affordability, renters, but also improved planning processes. So that's an interesting statement in the Age, if that is in fact correct, because this task force that is mentioned in recommendation 1, of course, is yet to be established. And I must say to our viewers that the VLGA will be seeking to have input into that task force, whether it is directly or through our seat on the table with local government Victoria.
Assuming the government accepts the recommendation to have a task force.
That is a good point. Look, that Age article, and I know that it's just one of many, has some interesting comments too from Marcus Spiller, who our viewers might know well, has been around from SGSS Economics and Planning, and is a great supporter of local government. But he does make some interesting comments about, I guess, what he's referred to as an ad hoc approach, and the implication being that there has been a lack of a sort of a statewide sort of strategic plan.
Regardless of having Operation Sandon and the IBAC report, we were moving down a spectrum that was towards the state government having greater involvement in local planning decisions. And we're seeing that particularly in the metropolitan areas with the major projects facilitation process, initially when that was, announced, I think there was some expectations that, major state significant projects would be the ones that got called in inverted commas. Now we're seeing, projects of 10 million and above, thresholds like that being called in, often in both inner ring suburbs, middle suburbs, and which is simply, residential housing developments with perhaps with an element of affordable housing. They are being regarded as so significant that the minister will call them in routinely. So I think we were already going down this path to a degree, and if anything, this report is just likely to accelerate that process.
Infrastructure Victoria, of course, have put out over the years, I think it was a 30-year strategic plan, amongst some other recommendations to the state government about their concerns or their, I guess, focus is on that. It's about delivering smarter land use and infrastructure planning policies. And it'll be interesting. I did see that the Infrastructure Victoria CEO, Jonathan Spear, made some comments about that in that Age article also, and how important, I mean, it always has been, the evidence has shown that to be that, we just need to get the infrastructure right to support whatever the planning processes might look like.
So, panel, the next group of recommendations around donations and lobbying, which we haven't talked much about. First thoughts on whether those recommendations are going to be well accepted?
I think this in the sector, yes. I did think that this was the area that the Premier walked back the most in the initial press conference, and I wonder whether that will be implemented. But so the notion that there's a register or a schedule of relevant donations, having donations made by interested parties to a matter before a resolution is considered. So councillors walking into a council meeting to vote on a matter would be faced with having to read and a schedule that says that, the applicant, these objectors have donated or have an interest in this outcome, and they have donated this in kind or pecuniary support to such and such individuals, and then the councils have to physically sign that when they make their conflict of interest declaration, is interesting for me, and is designed to avoid this scenario where some of the Casey councillors, where there were adverse findings, said they weren't aware of the relationship between a resolution at hand and Mr. Woodman and his interests. However, let me say, when there are corporate entities involved, just having the entities listed won't necessarily help councillors. You're going to need to have, presumably, the company search, the details of the directors and shareholders. Sometimes there are holding companies. Do you trace that back to the ultimate ownership? So it's not as simple as just putting that register up to solve that problem so easily, but I think it's a welcome proposal.
Chris, I support what Tony said. Apropos of your introductory comments, can we add the political parties to the group or to the list of those who might be chastened by the report? Because it would appear from that there was some facilitation of donations to individual candidates via the party rather than going into a pool that were hidden. And I think, to Tony's point, therein lies the risk that there, wherever there is an attempt to obfuscate or muddy the waters as to where the donation comes from. So it really requires everything Tony's described. Penalties that are serious, because there will always be an opportunity. And what came out in the report was that in some cases donations were split. So they had the appearance of being smaller from one party than they actually were. And making sure there is that traceability.
And I think that's why that problem you've identified, Steve, is why the IBAC recommendation itself, I think recommendation 13 was to consider banning, wholly banning donations from those high-risk groups, i.e. developer organisations.
The planning, donations, lobbying recommendations bring us to, that's recommendation 16 is the last one, bring us to council governance. So just before we get into that section, is there anything else planning related that any of you wanted to add to that conversation before we move on to a different topic?
I just wanted to flag for our viewers that we will actually be probably within the next week or 10 days, running a live panel with some folk who are very familiar with the New South Wales planning system, just to give us an overview of how that works currently, and certainly to provide us with a perspective from the elected representatives up there who are councillors. So just stay tuned for that.
Excellent idea. And Steve?
Chris, I've just scribbled out a list now, whether it's a panel or councils, as to what are the characteristics that the community might reasonably expect from those charged with making planning decisions. I just hope you don't mind it. I thought we need people who understand the local context, and I think the Age article talked about that contest between local representation and what should be an administrative process. We need people who understand the planning legislation, and it is complex, who actually can deal with that sort of conceptual strategic framework and, you know, make priorities based on sound reasons. We need conflicts of interest eliminated, and I think that's clear in the panel report. But also, I think local communities, to Tony's point around state government control, need to know that political pressure is being withstood as well. That, and I think at the moment from councillors, what came through in the report was that the councillors be actually interested in the planning topic, because it became apparent that some weren't, and also have the necessary assertiveness to not be swayed. Now, I don't say any of that saying, you know, leaning towards the recommendation or not, because clearly for some councillors there would be a training need there.
Absolutely, and I think we shouldn't overlook the fact that some of the recommendations that do relate to planning in this report might be well received by some councillors out there, who will be relieved, but that potentially what keeps them awake at night and burdens them, and is an area that they don't have those skills that you just outlined, Steve. Will enable them to get back to, you know, really focusing on their work as a council and representing their community in other ways.
So let's move on to the governance-related recommendations. It's 18 of these. Tony, you mentioned at the outset things like model codes of conduct, model transparency policies, model governance rules, I think, in here as well. That's an interesting direction in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, and I would say a theme here is that it's making explicit in be it the legislation or in the guidance coming from local government Victoria in model rules and model policies, etc., making explicit what I think is already good practice, and I think is already largely done by much of the sector. So, for example, there was a lot of criticism of some of the Casey councillors for declaring conflicts of interest, and then certainly in relation to, say, Councillor Ablett, were behind the scenes seeking to convince their colleagues to take a particular position on a vote that Councillor Ablett had already declared a conflict of interest. There was reference to text messages from Councillor Ablett in the lead up to a meeting. Now, I think it's well understood throughout the sector, and most, to my knowledge, overwhelmingly, councillors follow the approach that when one declares a conflict of interest, not only does one leave the room, one's not involved in seeking to lobby your colleagues or convince them to take a position. So quite a number of scenarios like that. So the move to prohibit en bloc voting, moving a whole set of motions at once, which, of course, from a public's perspective can give doesn't show adequate transparency, show that there's adequate, consideration and debate on individual items. It's a very rare thing, I think, across the sector for there to be en bloc voting. Many councils, in fact, expressly prohibit it, but in practice it rarely occurs. It happens to be that it would seem that it was occurring regularly at Casey Council during a period that IBAC investigated, but not across the sector. Yes, many of these changes, I think, just would reflect better practice. Some I'd just say it's really critical. This is why it's really critical for sector representative organisations like VLGA to be involved in the implementation. For example, the councillor briefings, I'm not sure that it will make for better decisions if councillors don't have an opportunity to discuss the substance of agenda items or issues outside the ordinary council meeting. And if we think of, this is not what occurs in the parliament, the parliamentarians don't just walk in and go, oh, let's have a debate and then we'll work out how we're going to vote. Everything goes through parliamentary committees, party room discussions, such that the parliamentarians are well aware of, an item when it comes in as a draft bill. So I do think that there needs to be some nuance there. There needs to be opportunity for councillors to feel that they can have a flowing discussion about what does this mean? Is this a good thing? Have we, are there groups that are affected that we haven't consulted on this? These are all aspects that councillors, I think, should feel comfortable raising in a briefing session. And if the language is too prescriptive, it might lead to councillors feeling, uncomfortable doing that.
Can I absolutely support what Tony said there? Because I think in considering the report, the sector's really at a crossroads. And I'm not the first person to say this over the last few days, but we are dealing now with a Principles-Based Act, and we have been IBAC has presented a quite prescriptive report. Now, the crossroad is, does government pay attention to the miscreants, or do we work on supporting councillors and skilling them up to help them to be their best? Because, a lot of, as Tony's described, a lot of those recommendations in the governance section, we know about. We know about en bloc voting, we know about not making decisions in briefings. We know about declaring conflicts of interest, but recognising and acting at our best. I think supporting the sector to do that, is another piece of work.
And I think it's worth noting that, as you've just picked up, it's moving back towards a more prescriptive way of doing things than the principles base which the new Local Government Act was built on. These behaviours that have been investigated and leading to these recommendations occurred before the new Principles-Based Act even came into effect.
Look, that's true. Although I was speaking with someone recently who suggested that the previous act was also principles-based, and over time just became the document that we knew it to be before the 2020 Act came in. Look, I think some of the positive takeaways from the report which are consistent, I think, with the VLGA's work, also our previous messaging and conversations with government, are around that improved, what I've interpreted as improved support and training for candidates. So for those wishing to become a councillor, but also those who are councillors. And I was very pleased to see, the recommendation that talked about mid-term refresher training, for example. I mean, we do that already with quite a number of councils, but to have it as a matter of course, but also I think for the community who at times can be critical when they see that their councillors are spending money on professional development, to see this is an actual requirement. This is a serious role, a serious responsibility that these councils are assuming, and our community members should be demanding that there is an investment in their ongoing development, upskilling. So those types of recommendations are certainly consistent with our submission to the cultural review into local government, consistent with the work that we do with our member councils, and very pleased to see that that's been captured there.
Am I right that the recommendations talk about training for council laws, refresher training, etc., but they don't really address the before you become a councillor piece? Given we've got a training requirement for candidates to complete, would it not make sense, if you're going to go down this path, to include that in the pre-election training for prospective candidates?
No, it's not in there. I don't think it's in there. I think that they're two different pieces. One is if you're going to run for council, I think you need to know what your role involves, what sort of time demands will be placed upon you. How often you're going to meet. How long are the meetings? What sort of level of reading material you might need to have. Maybe some advice on preconceived bias, winky pops type things when you're, campaigning. But I think that there is that key piece in terms of inducting councillors, and the midterm updates, I think, are a great thing. It's something most councils are adopting this process anyway. There are midterm refreshers typically anyway, even though they're not mandated. And I see great value in this. I don't see how this would change what the behaviour that occurred. Potentially, it would seem with the two councillors were particularly adversely named, councillors Aziz and Ablett. It wouldn't seem that the problem for them was understanding that they had a conflict of interest. It would seem that the issue, according to the findings in the report at least, was that they felt that they'd be able to get away with sometimes not declaring, and sometimes declaring but still being involved. So they didn't have a problem identifying there was an issue there. There was a problem of concealment.
I think that, Tony, that goes to the importance of not adopting a tick-the-box approach, because even with a model governance rules, we know that really high-performing councillors put that work in around the relationship between the councillors, early resolution of disputes, steps to actually remove or, reduce as far as possible bullying and harassment. And that just requires work. And the report is quite critical in terms of, that sort of behaviour you describe around the bullying and the intimidation and the impact that has on the quality of governance.
And look, one of the other things I just wanted to point out was certainly in some of the panels that we've held for our member councillors, where we've had the integrity agencies around the table, the local government inspectorate, IBAC, the Auditor General. Conflicts of interest do keep councillor, and the concept of declaring or not to, and what does it mean and what does it look like, is something that does concern councillors in terms of they're not quite sure they understand it correctly, or they do understand it correctly, but they're not feeling particularly confident around their understanding. It does keep them awake at night. So I think, I can see why the report has picked up on the need for that sort of ongoing and mandated conflict of interest training. And of course, when something is mandated, and I'm not suggesting that it should or it will be, those people who often don't turn up for the training when it is not obligatory that they do so, are often the ones that we really do want in the room being involved in those discussions.
Kathryn, Tony might have a view on this, but the IBAC hearing examination, I suppose, of with Glenn Patterson was really interesting, where Mr. Redlick took a very personal interest in asking Mr. Patterson around what powers the CEO has to report misconduct. And it seems that IBAC have taken a great deal of notice of that particular piece of evidence, because, Tony, if I got this right now, that there's a strengthening of the role of the inspectorate and of reporting to the inspectorate, but now saying that the CEO should report misconduct if they suspect that the breach of the governance rules might be, might be in relation to an underlying corrupt conduct.
That's absolutely right, there, Stephen, and so it's it sort of mirrors the current provisions about reporting suspicions of serious corruption. They apply at the moment, and it's mandatory for CEOs to report those suspicions. Now it will be the proposal in the recommendation being that CEOs would have a mandatory obligation to report reasonable suspicions they have that there's been a failure to declare a conflict of interest. Now, that would seem to me to apply to material conflicts of interest, as opposed to the more general, what would a reasonable person think in the circumstances type conflicts. I do think it places CEOs in a very different position than they're in at the moment, where they might give advice to councillors sometime or seek to ensure they better understood their statutory obligations. But ultimately, it's up to those councillors to declare or not, and the CEO, hasn't got a directed role to report concerns in that regard.
Do you see this making it more likely or less likely that CEOs and governance managers would be prepared to provide advice to councillors around whether they have a conflict of interest or not?
Well, I think giving that advice probably sits well with then having an obligation to report, because if the advice is not followed, one could say, make that point when the report was being made. I think something else slightly along these lines is that CEOs and other members of council staff, and indeed members of the public, if all the recommendations here are adopted, will be able to report breaches of the council or code of conduct to the Chief Municipal Inspectorate for the purposes of an arbiter investigation or a councillor conduct panel. That picks up, I think, on some of the recommendations that LG Pro had in their culture review. Again, I can see both sides of that argument. It's a difficult position for a CEO to be in after the event, having reported one of their councillors, and then, we don't know what the outcome of that code of conduct panel might be. Councillor might not be found to have contravened the code of conduct. That would create issues. But I suppose if the council laws themselves aren't involved in the employment decision, the CEO would have some level of comfort going forwards. The last piece I'd say on that conflict of interest element is, again, on this theme of recommendations that actually reflect best practice anyway, and that is the requirement to provide sufficient detail when one declares a conflict of interest. Good practice is one doesn't just say, I've got a conflict on item 4.1, I'm leaving the room, but to provide some detail for the public and their councillor colleagues as to what is the conflict, what is the relationship that gives rise to the conflict. And that's certainly being made explicit in one of the recommendations.
Chris, I agree with Tony there. But to your question also, there is a recurring theme in integrity investigations generally, Royal Commission into Robodebt, aged care, the financial sector, various IBAC and Ombudsman's reports around this topic of willful blindness of people who ought to know but didn't look. And I think as a cultural piece, it's going to be really important, I think, for public administration generally, just to create stories that it is okay to report. And, CEOs already have that sort of responsibility of, well, councillors, now that I know, I can't unknow. I have to do something with it. And so, to your question, I think there'll be more reporting.
Which raises
Yes.
the question, of course, with some of the recommendations as to, the cost of implementing and also then upholding those recommendations. As we know, the local government inspectorate is probably not the most well-resourced integrity agency in the state, and if they will incur additional responsibilities as a result of this report. And similarly, the councils themselves. So there are some questions there for the task force to examine, should the task force be established, as to who will pay, for example, for the independent planning review bodies.
Okay, we probably should look at how we wrap this up. That's been I think we've covered nearly everything except perhaps the proposed requirements for the minutes of council meetings to record the names of every councillor who speaks on a motion. And basically what I say is the death of the division, record who voted for and against each motion, regardless of whether a division is called. I imagine minute secretaries are delighted to see this if it was to be implemented, Steve.
I'm not sure, Chris, but I know some councils have already gone down that path in terms of the automatic division. And look, I've got to say my inner governance person rails against this, because I've always sort of had this view, it's the decision of the council and that's what we should be recording, and not who voted for what. So it gets undermined somewhat, but I absolutely get the need for transparency, and I wouldn't die in a ditch over what I just said. The one that I wasn't sure about was that the recommendation around reporting the speakers for and against a motion, and whether in the law of unintended consequences, it just might lead to councillors feeling that they ought to speak on a topic so they get their name in the minutes, and whether it will actually help the quality of debate.
And don't we have councillors speak to motions that they haven't actually made their mind up yet? They might not be speaking for or against. They're just wanting to participate in the debate and wait to hear the other councillors' views before they decide. Tony, you're an ex-councillor. Is that feasible?
I've seen it all, I think, but we've seen, councillors get up and think, well, I better look like I've got something to say, and stand up and say, essentially, I agree with what the last person said. And there'll be more of that if this goes ahead. But then I've also sat through councils where, that one term there was a councillor I don't think spoke at a council meeting the whole term. So, there's some accountability. There's an element of transparency here. I do agree that could have some unintended consequences. As Steve says, councils like Maroondah are recording routinely, who voted which way. Councillors like Warrnambool are regularly recording things like who spoke on a matter. So, I think this will improve, and is designed to improve the public's awareness of how governance takes place and what's occurring in a meeting, without having to actually watch the whole recording to understand who participated.
I should point out the recommendation actually does say the names of the councillors who spoke on each motion, not for or against. The for or against only comes in for the vote.
Chris, wherever government lands on this recommendation, to your initial comment, I think the governance staff will take it in their stride and it will just happen.
Yes. All right. That's been great discussion. Steve and Tony, thank you for your insights. Kathryn, I wonder if you'd like to somehow wrap this up.
Look, I don't think it is a wrap up. Certainly the topic of discussion. And this is just the beginning of that discussion. Really pleased that we're able to have Tony and Steve with us today, Chris, to unpack, I guess, the report. Still very early days. From the VLGA's perspective, what we'll be doing is considering in detail the recommendations and forming and also in consultation with our members, forming a position that we will then use to engage with local government Victoria and the state government on. As I mentioned during our discussion, we will be advocating quite strongly that we have a seat at the table in a form to to be able to influence or at least have input into the task force should it be established. We will be also providing a comprehensive members briefing in probably coming days. And having now spoken with the Deputy Commissioner of IBAC, David Wolf, he will be very pleased to come and speak with us and unpack some of those questions that we were pondering in our conversation today. So stay tuned for that.
Excellent. Thank you, Kathryn. Looking forward to more discussions on this momentous topic, which has the potential to make some very significant changes to the way councils operate in Victoria. Steve Cooper, thank you very much. Great to see you, and to somehow sort of close the loop, I guess, on that one for you. Tony Raunic from Hunt & Hunt Lawyers, thank you for your thoughts as well. And of course, Kathryn Arndt, the CEO of the VLGA. Thank you to our viewers and listeners of VLGA Connect. Stay tuned for more coming very soon.